Welcome to the EPG Pathshala. I'm Dr. Anita Bhela from the University of Delhi. And this module today, which we will be doing, has been prepared by me. Today we will be studying Sidney's An Apology for Poetry. It has been written for the paper, Literary Criticism. Sidney's Apology for Poetry was written as a rejoinder to Gausson's School of Abuse. This was the time when poetry and poets came under attack in Elizabethan England, and Sidney took up cudgels to espouse the cause of poetry and poets. So today we will be discussing how and in what ways Sidney defends poets and poetry and what he expects the poets to do for society. Sir Philip Sidney was born in 1554 and died in 1586. He led a short but meaningful life, and during this short period of life, he produced many works of literature and today has been classified as the first literary critic of England. His parents were educated, and Sir Henry Sidney, he was the Lord Deputy of Ireland under Elizabeth, and his mother was lady-in-waiting to Queen Elizabeth I. His sister, Mary Sidney, was very close to him, and later on published a composite edition of the Arcadia, which was called the Countess of Pembroke's Arcadia. He had his schooling at Shrewsbury Grammar School, and the education that he received was humanistic, and he also studied the Latin classics over there. His tutor was Thomas Ashton. He was one of the age's notable educators. He had his further education at Corpus Christi College, Oxford, and he studied there for 3 years. Amongst his contemporaries were Richard Halkett, the geographer, and William Camden, the historian. In 1571, at the age of 17, Sidney went on a grand tour of continental Europe and visited many countries and perfected his knowledge of Latin and French and German. And he acquired a humanistic education by meeting different kinds of people: kings, queens, philosophers, theologians, and poets. Later on, he became member of parliament, and he was betrothed to Penelope, that is the queen's godchild, but Penelope, however, married Lord Robert Rich. Later on, he married Frances Walsingham. He was appointed governor of Flushing in Holland, and later on he fought along with his uncle in Zutphen in Holland, but he was wounded, and although he battled gallantly, he was unable. He developed gangrene and later died. He was honored by and was given a lavish funeral in England. His lifelong friend Phil Greville was highly disturbed at the death of his friend Sidney, and paid him a tribute by writing a book in his honor. The death of Sidney was a death mourned by all, because, as his biographer Ellen Stewart has said, among the gilded youth of Elizabethan England, no one was more golden than Philip Sidney. Courtier, poet, soldier, diplomat, he was one of the most promising young men of his time. Coming to Sidney's An Apology for Poetry. An Apology for Poetry was published in 1595. Although it was written much earlier, most likely in response to Stephen Gausson's School of Abuse, which was published in 1579. And Gausson's School of Abuse leveled serious charges against poetry and poets. An Apology for Poetry is a carefully planned, organized argument in the form of a judicial oration. It can be divided into the following divisions. A. Exordium, an introduction announcing the topic in such a way as to gain attention and goodwill. Sidney begins with a humorous reference to the treatise of John Pietro Pugliano written in praise of horses and horsemanship. Next comes narration, the statement of the facts of the case. Sidney states the poet's aim, that is to teach and delight. Next follow the propositio, that is the thesis or argument. Sidney refers to three kinds of poets. Next comes the confirmation, that is evidence that supports the thesis. Sidney gives arguments that show the superiority of poetry over other disciplines. Refutation, that is answering of arguments. Sidney answers all charges leveled against poetry. Digressio, that is digression. Sidney deals with the state of poetry in England in his own time. Perorati, that is the conclusion. Sidney concludes his apology with a touch of humor as he began. He says, and promises wisdom, name, fame, and blessings to those who appreciate and value poetry, but lays a curse on those who fail to appreciate poetry. He says, while you live in love and never get favor for lacking skill of a sonnet, and when you die, your memory die from the earth for want of an epitaph. In the apology, Sidney attempts to defend poetry from all the charges leveled against it from the time of Plato. He praises poetry and poets to the highest level, and in order to do so, he draws on both Plato and Aristotle to define poetry and defend poets. Firstly, he considers poetry as mimesis, and he follows Aristotle in this, but with a difference. He says, poesy therefore is an art of imitation, for so Aristotle termeth it in his word mimesis, that is to say, a representing, a counterfeiting, or figuring forth to speak forth, metaphorically, a speaking picture with this end to teach and delight. So his idea of poetry or the concept of mimesis was different from that of Aristotle, in that he emphasized the idea that poetry was meant to teach and to delight. According to Plato's theory of forms, art is thrice removed from reality. It is a reflection of a reflection, and therefore it is the least real. Sidney uses Plato's theory of forms to suit his own purpose. He says that the poet works on the idea of a foreconceit, based on which he presents a golden world, not brazen as the actual world is. And therefore, he comes close to Plato's idea of the ideal form. He thus assigns to the poet the work of the creator and also sees him as the bridge between the real and the ideal. Sidney believes that the imaginative, hallucinatory character of poetry is justified by its utopian desire. Sidney also felt and said that poetry was superior to both history and philosophy. He felt that history was restricted because it could only show the experience of past ages and only tell what happened. On the other hand, philosophy, he felt, was abstract and moralizing. Why? Because it only tells about virtue and vice, and it tells it with a lack of beauty, of clarity, or style, and it teaches only those who are already learned. However, poetry, he said, is superior to both because it both teaches and delights. It combines the precept with the example, and it achieves what cannot be achieved either by the historian or by the philosopher. Why? Because the poet not only shows and tells what virtue is, but also turns that gnosis, knowledge, into praxis, that is, performance. The poet, by representing ideal characters, leads men to virtuous action. According to Sidney, poets must aim to lead men to virtuous action. He feels that the poet can achieve this through the representation of moral ideas in heroic characters and actions by initiating moral and political abstractions such as the ideal ruler, the just state, and social and civil felicity. Sidney felt that the poet could achieve much through presenting idealized characters like Cyrus, as in Xenophon's Cyropedia, not only to make Cyrus, which had been but a particular excellency as nature might have done, but to bestow a Cyrus upon the world to make many Cyruses. For long it was felt that the Cryopedia was a historical account, but later it was established that it was an idealized account, and proves true Sidney's own belief that in order to present virtue and vice as good examples, history may be fictionalized. Sidney divides poetry into three kinds: religious, philosophical or informative, and that of the right kind. He believes that poetry of different kinds pleases for different reasons, and therefore, based on style, structure, and theme, Sidney makes categories of the right kind of poetry. He places epic or heroic poetry at the top, and then comes pastoral and elegiac, iambic, satiric, comedy, tragedy, lyric, though not in the same order. And he goes on to tell us how each kind pleases and serves a specific purpose. Like other Renaissance writers, Sidney too places epic or the heroic at the top as being the loftiest of all yarns. And he also says that epic pleases because it presents the loftiest truths in the loftiest manner. Heroic characters like Aeneas and others inspire and instruct and are worthy of emulation. He believes that epic poetry can tell us the highest truths and it can help us to acquire virtue. Pastoral poetry deals with the humble life and arouses our sympathy and understanding for the simple life and abhorrence for tyrants. Elegiac poetry, that is sad poetry, stirs our kindly pity. Iambic poetry weeds out wickedness. Satiric poetry, through the use of ridicule, attempts to weed out any follies of mankind. Comedy, of course, deals with the weaknesses and follies of mankind and treats them in a light-hearted manner in order to weed them out. Tragedy tells us about the uncertainty of the world. It arouses in us the emotions of pity and awe, and it is so powerful that it can even bring tears to the eyes of a tyrant. Lyric poetry sings of all that is praiseworthy and it enkindles virtue and courage in us. Sidney goes on to refute all the Puritan allegations that were leveled against poetry at this time. As I mentioned earlier, Gausson's school of abuse attacked poetry and poets for many reasons. One of the charges that was leveled against poetry was that there were more fruitful knowledges a man might better spend his time in than in poetry. To this, Sidney responds by saying that the aim of all teaching, learning, is to promote virtue. And as he has already demonstrated in the Apology, poetry does it best out of all sciences, and therefore the study of poetry is the most profitable. Some accuse poetry as being the mother of lies. To this charge, Sidney replies that poets are not liars, for they never affirm that they are telling the truth. Unlike the historians, the poet's truths are ideal and universal in nature. Sidney goes on to refute the other two written allegations leveled against poetry. To the charge that poetry is the nurse of abuse and has a wanton influence, debases the mind, makes men effeminate and unmartial, Sidney says that it is not poetry that abuses man's wit, but men who abuse poetry. So the fault lies not in poetry itself, but in the way poets write it. To the last charge that Plato banished poets from his ideal state, he argues that Plato was not so much against poetry as the misuse of poetry by the contemporary Greek poets and writers who abused it by misrepresenting the gods. For Plato in the Ion says that the poets are divinely inspired. And of course, Sidney also accuses Plato of going back on what he himself uses in his dialogues. Sidney acknowledges the decline of poetry and drama in his own age and enumerates different reasons for its decline. He says the poets of his time are not inspired. They lack the necessary knowledge to produce good poetry. They do not use classics as their models. He goes on to say that poets are made, not born. Even the fertilest ground must be manured. That is, the intricacies of the poetic art must be learned, and that needs knowledge and training, which the poets are not willing to put in. And therefore, we have bad poetry and drama in circulation, which again he refers to as not the fault of poetry, but the lack of people who do not know how to write good poetry. So it is not poetry that is to be abused, but man's wit. Next, we come to Sidney's views on drama, that is, his views on tragedy and comedy. Sidney believes that tragedy should arouse the Aristotelian emotions of pity and awe. It must deal with the fall of tyrants because that shows the triumph of virtue. Must follow the unities of time, place, and action. And he's against the mingling of tragic and comic scenes or of tragedy and comedy, because he feels that there should be no mingling of horns and pipes with funerals or kings with clowns. Sidney's views on comedy. Sidney makes a distinction between delight and laughter. He feels that delight is something that lasts, whereas laughter is something that only temporarily tickles, and that delight is possible even without laughter. Coming to the laughter of comedy, he says that the laughter of comedy should not cause pain to anyone. It should deal with the weaknesses, foibles, and follies of humankind with the aim of correcting them by bringing about self-knowledge. Sidney considered poetry important for its four special ethical effects. He says it purifies wit, it aids memory and learning, it enables judgment, that is, literary memories find new and possibly profound meaning in personal experiences, and that it enlarges conceit. In his apology, Sidney emerges as both a classicist and a romanticist. Why a classicist? Why? Because the ancients serve as his models. As we have noted, he often quotes the classical writers. He also observes the rules devised by them and urges that the unity stated by the classical writers be followed. As a romanticist, his belief is that the poet is divinely inspired and that the poet uses his imagination to create fictionalized ideal worlds. Sidney, a theorist of the exuberant imagination, fuses the romantic and the classical elements. As a romanticist, he believes in the power of the imagination of the poet to create fictionalized ideal worlds. As a romanticist, he also believes that history may be fictionalized, that it may not present events in a chronological sequence so that the story can be presented in flashback. Sidney was a pioneer in English literary criticism. His is the first piece of criticism that is not based on theory but is practical in nature. Sidney brought sound scholarship and good knowledge to his criticism. He based his criticism on contemporary poetry that was being written, and apart from his rigidity in following the unities, we may see that Sidney generally doesn't go by rules and theories. His ultimate test is of a practical kind, and that test is the power of poetry to move to virtuous action. This was the test that was to be later also adopted by Johnson. In the Apology, Sidney gives us his ideas on all the existing forms of literature, on epic, on drama, on tragedy, on diction, and on meter. He follows the classics in advocating the use of simple language. He is also a pioneer in that he wanted to adopt the classical meters into the English language. The merits of the Apology. Firstly, although it has used ideas from various sources, still the Apology is an original document. It is the first piece of English literary criticism. Later writers of the 17th and 18th century, Dryden, Pope, and Samuel Johnson, took up Sidney's ideas and used them to formulate their own theories of poetry. The Romantics, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Shelley, and Keats, are all indebted to Sidney for assigning a divine status to poetry and for believing in the power of poetry to move people to do good. The Apology also epitomizes the best in the spirit of literary criticism that is derived from other sources. And it is the earliest attempt to deal with the poetic art practically, not theoretically. We see that Sidney always corroborates what he has to say through examples. What is Sidney's contribution to English literary criticism? Spinner says that dramatic criticism in England began with Sidney. And we are also told that he was head and shoulders above other theoretical treatises of the Elizabethan period, such as those of Gascoigne, Webb, Puttenham, Campion, and Daniel. Let us sum up. The Apology is written in the form of a classical oration. Sidney defends poetry against all the accusations leveled against it. He espouses the cause of poetry. He defends it. He tells us that poetry has the highest power to move and move to virtuous action. He believes that the poets, through creating a fictionalized, idealized world, can motivate people to be good. The function of poetry is not like that of history or philosophy, to show and tell only, but to teach and delight. Sidney believes that a poet has the power to move people to virtuous action. Sidney tells us and acknowledges the decline of poetry and drama in his own age. But then he goes on to say that bad poetry is not a reflection on poetry, but a reflection on the bad poets. Sidney is extremely rigid about following the unities. He wants that the action should be confined to a single revolution of the sun. He wants the action to take place only at one place. He wants that the unities be always followed. As we know, Johnson was to later defend the violation of the unities in his preface to Shakespeare. Sidney emerges as both a classicist and a romanticist. Sidney borrows from others, but in the end creates an original classic piece of literary criticism. For more details, refer to the e-text. Thank you.